This is Killer Innovations, a show about ideas, creativity, and how you can innovate. Welcome to the Innovator's Garage, where you learn to create your next game-changing killer innovation.
So do you ever look at others who are successful and say, boy, are they just lucky? A favorite Zig Ziglar quote of mine is, you were born to win, but to be a winner, you must plan to win, prepare to win, and expect to win. Now, the corollary is if you fail to plan, then you're planning to fail. I'm Phil McKinney, and you're listening to Killer Innovations. So how do organizations plan to win? By making investments that they think will put them into a leadership position in their industry. And today's guest is somebody that takes a look at it from the outside, from an investor's perspective, and looks at it from shareholders' view of identifying those companies who are doing the innovation right. So, Steve, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Phil. Thanks for having me.
No problem. Hey, Steve, why don't you just give us a quick 60-second radio commercial for you and what it is you do?
Sure, and I'll try to keep it under that. We're an investment firm located in Denver, Colorado. We manage about $600 million. We have ETFs, mutual funds, and separately managed accounts. And our investment strategy is based on the hypothesis that highly innovative companies generate excess returns in the long run. And so we're trying to convert this abstract theory, again, that highly innovative companies generate superior risk-adjusted investment results, into portfolio results for investors. We're pioneers in the field of innovation investing. We're the only firm that bases its investment strategy on evaluating companies on the basis of their knowledge investments. And we've created a proprietary method to recalculate historic operating performance for companies incorporating their knowledge investments.
So, there's a lot of people out there that have all tried to take a look at least at innovation as being highly valuable. But, in the case of your work and just the general investment population, why should we care? Is innovation really that important from the standpoint of the share price? Why should the listener care?
Well, we recently wrote a white paper describing what we call the knowledge effect. And in essence, there's an anomaly in the stock market where companies that are successfully employing an innovation strategy over time, as I mentioned earlier, experience excess returns. And so it's really that these companies employing a consistent innovation strategy over time consistently exceed investors' expectations. And so, the roots of this are two things. One, our current accounting framework is a somewhat antiquated method of keeping score, especially for highly innovative companies. It's an industrial era kind of system that really looks at companies from the standpoint of assuming that they buy their capital from somebody else, like an industrial company would, rather than building it themselves. And so the act of building a firm-specific capital stock is poorly captured by accounting standards. And what's ironic is that FASB, the Financial Accounting Standards Board, put this in place, forcing companies to expense all of their knowledge investments in 1974, 3 years after Intel launched the first commercially available semiconductor, thereby launching us into the digital age. And so we have this issue where accounting standards really are not meant for highly innovative companies, and they distort the information to investors and really rob investors of value-relevant information about company innovative investments. And it's this absence of information that leads to this behavioral bias, this anomaly in the stock market. And so really, the most innovative companies do well because there's a dearth of information, and investors lurch from overly penalizing a company when they're in the investment phase to then outrageously rewarding a company when they're past that investment phase. And so that's the essence of the knowledge effect and how we tend to look at innovation from an investment standpoint.
So is there directly a correlation? Does that evidence suggest that companies that pursue this strategy, rather than just doing, managing it to what you have to report on the quarter, do they do better from the standpoint of a share price today?
Well, Phil, I think it's important to recognize that, the whole premise here is that intangible investments, R&D, brand development, employee training, are all value-relevant activities. And so from the standpoint of the manager that's allocating capital for these things, the manager likely thinks of these endeavors as investment, that they're developing assets for the firm, and in turn these assets will generate income in the future. And so FASB's decision in 1974 really severed the link between those two things and again created this vacuum. And so NYU professor Baruch Lev was really the first one to dive into this issue in 1993. And in his work, he found a statistically significant relationship between the amount of intellectual property that a company has and its subsequent stock price performance. He refined that idea in 2005 to address your specific question and say really that in an absolute sense, more innovation or less innovation is not the key. It's contextualizing that innovation within respective industries. And so he took all companies in a variety of industries and looked at each company relative to its industry and determined relative to its industry which companies spent the most on innovation. And that was a quantitative way to flesh out the idea that within any given industry, there are companies that are pursuing a deliberate innovation strategy, and then there are companies pursuing a mimicking strategy that are just trying to, let's say, capitalize on the intellectual property spillovers going on in an industry. And so, again, we believe there's a connection. It's not necessarily a direct, linear, one-for-one connection. It's a relationship that tends to play out over time, and it's a communication flow between what companies are doing, why they're doing it, how the information is presented to shareholders, and how shareholders interpret that information.
So is there a specific time frame during which, these companies that are doing the investments could outperform? Because innovation and investment don't last forever. It's one of those, it's the monster you have to constantly feed.
No, that's a fantastic point, Phil. And, were this anomaly to exist in perpetuity, then kind of by definition it wouldn't necessarily be an anomaly. And so what the academic literature suggests is that, there tends to be a 5-year window after a company makes an intangible investment or increases its rate of intangible investment where that excess return plays out. And it tends to be a two-phase thing where at first the companies are in the investment phase and investors see all the expenses, but they don't see any earnings or revenues to show for it. But then, a couple of years hence, companies manifest new products and revenues and earnings begin to be produced, and then all of a sudden investors tend to, overreact to that kind of news. So again, just to sum it up, it tends to be a 5-year window after companies engage in intangible investments where investors will have a lagged reaction to that information.
Well, that's great given the time frame. Hey, Steve, stay right where you're at. We're not done. In the next segment, we're going to talk about companies that are leaders, ones that are laggards, and I'm going to ask Steve also to give us kind of his 3 recommendations. If you're a leader, how do you think about your investment strategies to account for kind of this investor's perspective? I'll be posting links to Steve and his firm in the show notes at clearinnovations.com. That's also where you can find the past shows, and you can catch up with everything that we're doing.
Biz Talk Radio. This is Killer Innovations, a show about ideas, creativity, and how you can innovate. Welcome to the Innovator's Garage, where you learn to create your next game-changing killer innovation.
While many companies work hard to create a culture of innovation, and believe me, it's one of the more common activities I see going on in organizations today, some believe that doing the same thing they've done in the past is their path to success. Well, not me. I'm a believer of the Robert Collier school of thinking, which is if you don't make things happen, then things will happen to you. So we're picking up in this segment where we left off in the last segment with talking about the knowledge worker or the knowledge index from the standpoint of investment. and from an investor's perspective of those investments that actually have a positive impact on organizations. So, Steve, you measure companies' innovation activities and then screen for the most highly innovative. You kind of bucketize them into what you kind of call knowledge leaders. And there's also companies that I guess don't make the cut. I don't know what you call them, knowledge laggards, I guess.
Followers.
So talk us through kind of those kind of buckets. How do you do that? And what are some examples of those companies?
Sure. We use our knowledge-adjusted framework here. So we begin with roughly 3,000 companies around the world, and we take their financial history and we convert it into a knowledge-adjusted financial history by going in and capitalizing all of their identifiable intellectual property investments, things like advertising, research and development, and we have some proprietary ways of then extracting investments in brand development or employee training. And so once we have a modified set of financial statements going back for 30 years for all 3,000 companies, we apply a few screening criteria, and the companies that meet all the thresholds in our screen that then pass the test, and we consider them knowledge leaders. And so there's a few general criteria that we're looking for. We need to see a company invest at least 5% of sales in intellectual property. We need to see a company have at least 5% of their assets represented by intellectual property. And then we'll also look for, minimum other operating metrics like profit margins. We'll only look at companies with at least 20% gross profit margins. We'll only look at companies with, a 10% operating cash flow margin or above. And then we'll only look at companies below 50% net financial leverage. And the logic for that is that, when companies move to an innovation strategy, it tends to represent a drop in capital intensity for the company, and innovation investments tend to be equity financed. And so when we see all of those variables line up, that's the kind of company those are the kind of companies that pass our screens. And so, as you might imagine, many of the companies that pass these screens and are in our knowledge leader indexes are in, say, the healthcare and technology industries, but we also have some in the consumer products, advanced industrial, some basic material industries like chemicals and things of that nature. So at the same time, there are companies that don't meet the criteria for one reason or another. And so, an industry that might help illustrate this would be the pharmaceutical industry. So, companies that most people are probably familiar with, branded drug companies like Eli Lilly or Bristol Myers, these are all knowledge leaders. But then there are companies in the pharma industry like Mylan, who's a generic drug company that tends to follow a mimicking strategy that doesn't make the cut. So it really, each industry has its own dynamic, but that pharmaceutical example is a great idea, a great example of the kinds of companies that are innovation-led companies that pass our screens, and the kinds of companies that are mimicking companies that don't.
So, Steve, give us some examples of companies that are kind of on the way into or out of the knowledge leader status.
Well, let me focus on the companies that are on their way out. I wish my crystal ball was working so well recently to predict which ones would make it in. But what I can tell you is a couple companies that have fallen out of our index. Sony and BlackBerry would be two examples. And I think that the issue here was not that they stopped investing in intellectual property, rather that they failed to execute on their innovation strategies. And whether it was intentionally or unintentionally, they really fell into a mimicking strategy. And so this showed up for us as some of their operating metrics failing to hit some of our required thresholds. In particular, operating cash flow margins and return on invested capital fell below our required levels. And so, we want to see companies that spend dollars on innovation on the front end, but who then on the back end generate, very attractive rates of return, earnings and revenues for investors. This gives us a way to kind of connect the input with the output and say the companies that are successfully innovating, are generating the operating cash flow and the earnings on the back end. So when we see companies like Sony or BlackBerry fall off that pace, it gives us some quantitative metrics to follow that tell us these companies have fallen off the innovation strategy. And to be clear, we'll look at the trailing 7 years average of their operating cash flow, their return on invested capital. So it's not just one bad bad year. It really requires a company to get into a multi-year bad slump. So Sony is probably our best candidate to pull out of that relative to BlackBerry. They've gotten back on track with their profitability metrics, but now they really need to do a little balance sheet repair. When a company falls off the innovation track, oftentimes it resorts to its balance sheet and to taking on debt to plug the hole in the interim. And so Sony fell into that trap as well. And so now that they've gotten back on the operating performance path, they need to address the balance sheet. And so I would expect, at some point in the near future, with a couple balance sheet moves, that Sony should find its way back into knowledge leader status.
Well, that's some good insight. So from the standpoint of a leader within companies that pride themselves or who are trying to use an innovation strategy for their long-term success, can you give us 3 things that they should be thinking about that will help them in their business from the standpoint of how they think about it from an investor's perspective and how you in the market look at companies? What are those 3 things that the listener can kind of take away?
Yeah, that's a great question, Phil. I think the first thing is, an understanding that the accounting framework that is employed is really flawed when it comes to representing the activities of innovative companies, and it does a really poor job of communicating what's going on in the inside of a company to investors on the outside. So that's item number 1, recognizing that our accounting framework is flawed and does a poor job representing innovative companies. Number 2 is that accounting conventions are a communication medium between your company and its shareholders. And so while you as the CEO of a company may have a perspective on how you're allocating capital, looking at it as very intelligent investment that will lead to value creation in the future and is very logical, from the standpoint of your shareholders, that intent may not get communicated perfectly via our flawed accounting system. And so I think that sharing this perspective with investors is important, meaning that the perspective that you have as the manager of your business on how you're allocating capital. And in that, I think it's important for a manager to realize that investors tend to look at a company from a diversification standpoint. It's a well-worn financial idea that you can buy assets that have offsetting risks so as to minimize your exposure to any single risk. Well, investors like to hear that a manager of a business is looking at their portfolio of R&D projects or innovation projects in the same way. So communicating to investors that you don't expect every project to be a raging success, but that you're looking at this like a portfolio of projects that in aggregate you have a vision for value creation. And then the last thing would be to simply say that, even though FASB doesn't mandate companies giving a lot of information about their innovative activities, more information is better, more transparency is better, and in general, more information about your innovative activities and about your companies, the more likely it is that your company will experience excess returns as investors get a more complete picture of what exactly your vision is.
Yeah, I think those are all excellent points. I think all of us can just maybe pay a little bit more attention. So, Steve, if people want to follow what you're doing, how can they find you?
Sure, Phil. Our website is GaveCal, GAVEKAL, capital, CAPITAL.com, GaveCalCapital.com. We have our white papers and material displayed on our website, and we would certainly be happy to field any information requests from anybody about our thoughts on innovation.
Great. Thanks, Steve. I really appreciate it. If you want to stay and get connected with us here at Innovations, text the word innovate 33444 or drop us an email at innovate@killerinnovations.com. As we go into the last segment for the show, as you know, we've gotten the habit of I present these killer questions that will hack your brain. I'm Phil McKinney, and this is Killer Innovations on the BizTalk Radio Network.
BizTalk Radio,